Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair Yunus, and yes, I have been MIA for a number of weeks now. It's the summer, things get in the way, the world has been crazy, and so I was both busy but also struggling with figuring out what exactly should we be talking about given the pace of developments. And so now that things have settled down a bit, for what it's worth, I figured that was important to take a look at some of the key events that have happened. And as some of you may recall, when we began this year's season on the podcast, I talked about the fact that foreign policy in the region is going to be key. Primarily, also at that point, my thesis was that Donald Trump is going to insert a lot of volatility in ways that perhaps I was even surprised by, even though I was expecting that. So today we're going to be talking about what happened with the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict, which sort of escalated and then de-escalated in the same with the same rapidity as it escalated. And so, joining me today is Dr. Neda Bolourchi, who has been on the podcast before. And last time when we had Dr. Nida on, we were talking about protests in Iran, and there were like a whole movement that was beginning to emerge, and we talked about that. And then today we're going to be talking about, well, what happened with the Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict and what's next for Iran and its regime. For those of you who are not familiar, Dr. Nida is an interdisciplinary Middle East scholar and associate director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers-New Brunswick. She's an internationally renowned scholar, and her work includes international and comparative human rights, legal analysis, and foreign policy studies. So, somebody who really understands both the domestic, regional, and international dimensions of what's going on in Iran, its nuclear program, its internal politics. So, Dr. Nida, welcome once more to Pakistonomy, and thank you for taking out the time.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me back there.
I want to begin with sort of your takeaways, right? There have been a lot of hot takes, many of which were sort of proven wrong. And so I didn't want to have those conversations as, the dust was still settling. But now that we're a few days away from the chaos and the madness that we all saw, from your perspective, what are the key takeaways that folks should be paying attention to, learning from, and probably looking at moving forward in what President Donald Trump, described the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, although I would argue the US was also at war with Iran for some of those days. And then it also struck Iranian nuclear facilities. So, what stood out to you, and where do you see things going moving forward?
Well, thank you for that great question. I think there's so many things that we could have as the takeaways. I do think that first we need to probably emphasize one of the hot takes that came out immediately, and there was a good amount of outrage over it, is that we learned that the Islamic Republic hasn't addressed its massive intelligence failures dating back to last summer. And we can go further back to include, nuclear scientists who were assassinated, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, in November 2020. But none of these individual assassinations compare with the utter and complete failure that occurred with the series of assassinations last month. And those include the head of the military program, the commander-in-chief of the IRGC, the chief of staff of the armed forces, two more pivotally important nuclear scientists, five more, in addition to the pivotal ones, there are five other nuclear scientists and multiple other military members who were assassinated, and within, almost off the bat. And so this tells us that in addition to the fact that the Israelis it should seem, multiple inroads, the Islamic Republic has also probably not learned that it lacks objective analysis. It underestimates its adversaries, including Trump. It over relies on its own existing practices, beliefs, and protocols. So I think that we can't really underestimate what a significant failure, intelligence failure, this is. It is quite actually mind-boggling. I think that the second thing that we've learned is about Israel, and in addition to the fact that Netanyahu will do almost anything to save himself, intelligence and just political news tells us that his government was falling apart the day before launching the attack on Iran. And then, needless to say, within hours, the situation changed, his approval ratings changed. And so this is something that we've, learned about him. More generally, what we've learned about the Israelis is a little bit of what we kind of have known, but they've demonstrated it now, right? They understand the importance of surprise, strategic patience, which I think most people would not, most analysts and the larger public would not really say that they have, but they definitely have it. This plan was sitting there for quite some time, and Netanyahu just picked it up and went with it. And then the careful sequencing in military operations, along with simultaneous integration of technology, power pressure, AI, munitions. In this regard, from beginning to end, they were flawless. And so some of that is a bit surprising in terms of the extent of their intelligence inroads, as well as the simultaneous way that they were able to deploy drones, AI, and different munitions all at the same time that all needed to say careful sequencing is an understatement. I think third, back to the Islamic Republic, we learned that it has more missiles and more accurate missiles than what was previously understood. Generally, the world, from the Persian Gulf littoral states to Israel and the EU, the Caucasus, the Russians, the Chinese, everyone has been monitoring their missile program. It's actually been historically considered the most concerning threat to its neighbors. The Arabs had vehemently lobbied policymakers in DC to do something about the missile program. They were less concerned about the nuclear program because the missiles were actually existing things. The Islamic Republic was good with those short-range missiles. They could hit accurately those littoral states. And so this has been part of a lot of the analysis around how to deal with Iran's missile program. And part of those assessments that we've been part of is really that, okay, you as Arabs are concerned about the missile programs and the short range programs, and then the drones arrived. So there's more concern about the drones and the intelligence inroads that allowed for things like the Aramco attacks. But the Europe and the Israelis were not as concerned because those long-range missiles were considered wildly inaccurate. And then this was compounded by the fact that the Israelis have a multi-layer air defense system. What we saw last month was significantly much more accurate. And so in this sense, to just be more specific about it, is they not only have hypersonic missiles, but they also have this hypersonic glide vehicles. And so it's a warhead that attaches to a missile that makes it able to maneuver even faster, 5 times faster than the speed of sound. So, and then the Iranians were able to go longer. Part of the reason that and this is full circle now on technical prowess, the Israelis brought down about 84% of the missiles using this multi-layered air defense mechanism, which I'll talk about. But people wondered, well, why didn't it capture everything? One, not everything. It's not possible to capture everything. But two, the Iranians had more in their stockpiles. And as a result, one of the weaknesses of any system is, and despite the fact that it's layered, when you overwhelm a system, you're going to have a number get through. So at 84%, the Israelis did phenomenally well. But in terms of that system, the full mobilized system that we saw is not just the Iron Dome. It's David's Sling, which intercepts short and medium range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones. That multi-layered system includes Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 systems for longer range ballistic missiles, and then the Barak 8 for surface-to-air missiles. And then to add a little bit is the Sea Dome, which is the naval version of the Iron Dome. So that's for offshore assets, as well as an electromagnetic spectrum defense, again, for drone threats. So you not only have the quality and quantity of the Iranian air attack, having been better than what was estimated and what was seen previously. But then you also have proof of that the full layer of the Israeli system works very well. 84% is the last number I think I saw, and that's fantastic. With the caveat of this is very expensive. As the third, every time we talk about what are the things that surprised us. So for the daily rate was considered, I think most people have probably seen by now, $285 million a day, which comes to $3,420,000,000 for about 12 days. And that is actually considered the lower estimate. The higher estimate of that is just under 6 billion. So we're coming in at around 3 to 6 billion for those 12 days just on air defense, with a little bit of the Sea Dome included. So I think that was for the general public. Those are some surprising takeaways. I think the success, the technical prowess and advancements on both sides, as well as the phenomenal costs. In terms of the United States, we learned that President Trump doesn't necessarily telegraph and give everything away on social media. It has been seen that while he might engage in chaos theory, he also sometimes takes to social media to talk about that. And he did. He said, "No one knows what I'm going to do." And he really did not sort of drive the plan through onto social media. It was a surprise. He did veer back and forth at the start of the war about all of his decision making. So analysts really didn't, watchers did not really get it right. He did, he ran on, he campaigned on being against forever wars, but he showed that he would take absolute unprecedented steps to, as some are saying, get to negotiations faster, in the same way that the assassination of Soleimani was considered unprecedented and highly dangerous. I think that this actually was less risky. I think it was less risky given what has happened to Iran and its proxies in the last year. I think that this was significantly less risky. The discussions around retaliating against Qatar panned out exactly as was thought would be. So I think that and returning to Trump, while some in the MAGA movement may be disenchanted, momentarily concerned about miscalculations, I think that they might be buoyed by the fact that he did have a public, we might say, outburst and let his red line be known, particularly when he called out the Israelis first and then added Iran to that for the ceasefire. So I think I could go on for a bit here on the things that we've learned, but I think those are some 4 or 5 pretty big ones.
No, that's a pretty holistic and comprehensive takeaway. One follow on I had, particularly on the Iranian missile capacity, right? Like 84% is successful, but there were big hits on Israel in the process with the ones that got through. And one of the things I sort of followed when I was sort of reading up Iranian media or pro-government Islamic Republic media was this signaling, and it still continues to this day, that Iran never fully deployed all of its capabilities in this war. I don't know what to make of that. I was curious to hear your thought on, like, did they keep some stuff in the back, like in terms of not fully going all out, and what does that show about their capabilities moving forward?
Well, I think it's a little bit of an unknown, but for any strategic defense, you want to, I think the numbers are about maintain 30 to 50% of your stockpile, because you don't know how long the conflict or the war is going to go. So anything that you're engaging in on offensively, you want to make sure you have retaliation capabilities. So in the sense here that President Trump intervened, albeit after bombing the nuclear facilities, there was that moment where he calls back the Israelis. Well, without a doubt, had the Israelis proceeded, Iran would have again started firing its missiles. So you always want to be able to retain, because you just don't know where things are going to go. So 30 to 50%, I think, is a little high, because at a certain point, you really want to be doing some damage and sending your message. But 30 to 50% of your stockpile, you want to hold back in reserve. So when I say that the numbers were surprising, it's because of what was deployed. There's an assumption that there's another 30 to 50% of that at minimum. And so there are discussions about where have the tests on some of these missiles been done, how much stockpile do they have, where are they being held, that the estimates in terms of quantity were a bit off.
All right. So moving on now to like the domestic environment in Iran, right? Obviously, the supreme leader is aging. There's succession dynamics were at play even before this conflict. We've seen since October 7th, as you alluded to as well, that the Israelis have sort of rolled back Iranian proxies in the region. Hamas, Hezbollah, Bashar al-Assad is gone. The Houthis are still capable. They're still conducting attacks, but still fairly limited. And so Iran is, being its influence in the proxy game at least has been rolled back over the last few months. In addition to that, the government found itself in many ways like, losing its crown jewels essentially when the United States decided to conduct the surprise attacks on the nuclear facilities. How have the dynamics from your perspective shifted in Iran as a result of that? And I ask this from, in my mind, there's two sort of things that I'm competing thoughts, right? One is that as an observer, as a much closer observer of the India-Pakistan conflict that recently played out, India's aggressions were perceived as something that, united Pakistan behind its military, which was really unpopular in the run-up to that conflict. And since then, the army's made a comeback in terms of political standing. How long does that last remains to be seen. And then the other thought in my mind is on the Iranian side is, you really got hit hard and you lost your crown jewels, something that you spent so much money on in a country with sanctions, people are struggling, etc. So how has that conversation evolved post this conflict, and does the government and the sort of revolution find itself more secure or more imperiled on the domestic front as an outcome of this conflict?
So I'm I think going to even break it down a little bit more than that. I think that obviously and without a doubt, the Islamic Republic is maybe the weakest it's probably been in its 47-year history. And I will just, as a basic of political philosophy and theory, it was unable to maintain or provide security to its citizens. The utter and complete failure of air defense, the lack of air defense systems, is exactly what I'm pointing at. There, it was the Israelis had air dominance, and I think the word dominance is even an understatement here. And so that security is the primary provision of the social contract, and even in the Hobbesian world. And so in accord with that, the Islamic Republic is only standing because it maintains the monopoly of violence within its geographical borders against its own people, right? And so the analogies with the existential threat posed by Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which has been ongoing, are completely misplaced, because there was, despite the surprise of the invasion into Iran, there was a technical parity at the start of that war. And the outpouring of actual vehement nationalism, which was part of the excess of the 1979 revolution before it was fully Islamized because of that war, was significantly more. I don't think I can even, there's no comparison. I have not heard and let me give you examples. I have not heard the Islamic Republic announce a surge of volunteers enrolling into any of its military apparatus, which happened when Iraq invaded Iran. I have not heard that it's turning away volunteers because it's overrun with volunteers, which also happened when Iraq invaded Iran in 1980. So the sheer numbers and the lack of any sort of historical analogy aside from this obtuse one is misplaced. And that's some of the things that happened in 1980. So what you see, and I think what people are referring to, is do you have this buoy of nationalism? Does it translate to the government? So on a separate note, absolutely. There's an absolute nationalist sort of resurgence in Iran amongst Iranians. But this is very different. It's a love of country that's simultaneously historical and romantic, and it's rooted in civilizational discourse and historical discourse and familial ties and connections and even geography. And so this sort of longing and love Iranians have for their territory, it doesn't really translate well into English in this little time that we have. But I think the easiest and clearest, and something that Americans, and as you already pointed out, the people all over the world understand, is you can absolutely love and adore your country and hate your government. And that doesn't mean that you want to be bombed or that you want somebody else's notion of freedom delivered at the bottom of a barrel. And you can hold those positions simultaneously. And that's what Iranians are doing. I think, even I was talking about Anas the other week, he even sort of, I put the numbers down of ideological core supporters at 15%. And those numbers have been coming down, and he kind of pushed back and said 18 to 20. But 18 to 20% of 85 million people is your ideological core. That means the rest of them are either apathetic or veer from the spectrum of apathetic to hating your
If
government.
I may interrupt you, if
Yeah.
you get 20% of the vote in a first past the post parliamentary system, you're routed as a political party. Let's look at it from that perspective.
20% of 86 million is not shabby, but what I'm saying is we should not, that's a minority. It is a minority by any means. It will get you on a ballot, but the outpouring that people are seeing on TV or radio should not be seen as a love of government or the Islamic Republic. It is a love of country. And that doesn't mean, though, that one can't despise the government and still not want to potentially be killed in the process of the bombing that's happening. And I think that everyone, as I said, these are positions you can hold simultaneously. As you referred to, people the world over have hated their governments, but nevertheless rallied around the flag. It's a tenuous position. And in Iran, it's a long-standing discourse about like them being in Persian, Vatan Parast, Mihan Parast, and the imagery that goes with that. And particularly for the US media, it took a while for this to come through because you have other media and you have Iranians in the diaspora who are for bombing. But when you talk to, but I would say inside of Iran, they are, on the flip side, they are also a minority. If the ideological core is a minority, those who approve of that bombing, I think we're also a minority.
All right. And so related to that, the other thing I've been reading up on, and again, as you figure out, your lights happens to be in my office all the time,
I may have
is
to get up in a second, but yes.
feel free to do that as I weave my question. And the thought that people that I've been speaking to have always pointed out this fact that the supreme leader is old, and his succession battle is going to be epic in sort of the terms of the revolution and what it means going forward. And they explained to me as like, me being a total outsider who doesn't understand the intricacies of Iranian politics, that you have the IRGC that's seeking to deepen its control in the succession battle. And then you have sort of the regular armed forces, the Artesh, that also is trying to, get some larger chunk of control or influence in the system. And they point out to this fact that, even in terms of how the maneuvering is happening post this conflict, that's something to watch out for, this like intrigue. Can you help us understand like what are the wheels within the wheels in the Iranian system, and how are different players, in the status quo trying to either increase their dominance, or the weaker ones trying to reduce the dominance of their opponents in the system?
Well, I mean, I think that this notion, uh, so up until last month, when Khamenei basically announced that he had narrowed down possible successors to three people, how this has been kept a secret while the Islamic Republic hasn't solved its vital intelligence breaches, I'm not sure. We'll see how long this mystery or the secret holds out. Um, but I think, and prior to sort of his naming of three individuals, there has been this long assumption that the IRGC will basically take over, that there will, one, if there's a lot of external pressure, that the clergy will agree that they need a military leader. I would point out that let us not forget that Khamenei, one, was not the appropriately educated or populated. He was not an Ayatollah when he became supreme leader. The constitution changed for him. Two, he has military experience as a cleric because of the Iran-Iraq War. So I think some of the ideas going into the clergy aren't able necessarily to deal with modern politics of economics and military, they don't seem applicable to him. There's concern about it applying to the next generation. His son was previously considered one of the top sort of successor nominees, as was prior to his dying Raisi, before that helicopter went down. And so these are all men who also, they continued to have some military experience because there has not been a war, because the clergy haven't been per se part of, quote unquote, exporting the revolution that they were part of at the start of the Islamic Republic. The idea was that the Revolutionary Guard would basically take over, or there would be sort of a transition where a military leader would come. This gets compounded if you talk about the increase in external pressure against Iran, that in essence they would have to, in response to domestic intrigue as well as external pressure, they would go to the IRGC and find an appropriate leader who knows the politics, knows the geopolitics, the economics, in essence, maybe a Soleimani, right? I don't think that that is necessarily going to happen. And I still don't think that, because nobody has sort of answered the question of, you already have, the IRGC has already largely taken over the Iranian economy and is this military junta. What necessitates a change where a supreme leader has to be from the military? And there really isn't a very good reason, but there is a good reason why you wouldn't do that. It undercuts the whole entire notion of an Islamic Republic. If your leader is a military person completely, and doesn't have any of this clerical background, then why do you have an Islamic Republic? And I think for that reason, they may turn out to be more practical and pragmatic than I think in this regards, and they are in many other ways. But I think at its core, they will have at minimum a cleric that is a figurehead sitting atop the pyramid, and may be surrounded, as he largely is, military leaders.
Almost like the old Muslim sultanates, right, where the caliph is still the caliph is still the ruler, but essentially you have a situation where the military commanders in the citadel or in the city govern the fortress and sort of run everything for the caliph, and he's just a nominal head of state essentially because of the title and everything else associated with being who the caliph was at that point in time. the last question I have for you again is related to now the regional play. We've seen sort of a big rapprochement between the Saudis and the Iranians over the last few months now, and it has sustained. I think just yesterday, if I remember correctly, the Iranian foreign minister met Crown Prince MBS. Lots of diplomacy, but at the same time, lots of conversation about the Saudi role in Palestine and the normalization efforts and Abraham Accord 2.0 that the president here in DC talks about quite a bit. Um, what's next for Iran in the region, given that it's sort of key pieces of the chessboard have all been eliminated, basically? I think I was reading something a couple of days ago out of Lebanon that Hezbollah's disarmament is going much better than many anticipated. I don't know if it's 100% accurate or not, but that's what that report said. So, in many ways, the Iranians are shut out. The Turks are back in Syria after 100 plus years. The Saudis have their own, eye on the prize in terms of how rebuilding will happen in Syria and Lebanon and other places. And so, in many ways, if you look at the old historical conflict between the Persians and the Arabs in the peninsula, the Arabs are now making a comeback. So, where does that leave Iran, and how will Iran now recalibrate in a region where it's lost a lot of influence and now only Iraq perhaps remains in contention?
What I will say is what I think they should do. And I, just commented momentarily ago that they can be, despite sort of, I think there's a book that refers to them as the Mad Mullahs, very pragmatic and practical on a whole host of things. And so being pragmatic and practical, they need to focus internally. They need to rebuild all their cities. Contrary to sort of what the media shows, Israel hit multiple cities. Even the historic Zoroastrian city of Yazd, civilian sites. So the government needs to handle the economic and civilian infrastructural damage that the Israelis did. As clearly the forward defense strategy, which is what this is, the proxies are part of what Iran called the forward defense strategy. Was their foreign policy that if we basically fund and keep the region and the United States and Israel busy or concerned about these groups, then they won't attack us. Well, lo and behold, the proxies, the forward defense came down. And as soon as it was practical or necessary, Netanyahu went in and I think without Trump would have continued bombing. So there is something to be said about the forward defense strategy, but now that the billions, if not trillions, that built it up are gone, and as you said, Syria is lost. I think that government is doing everything and anything it can to make sure that sanctions get removed. It's collaborating and cooperating with the Israelis. Hezbollah is on its way to, as you said, disarmament. And so I think what was popularly known after the invasion of Iraq, the Shia Crescent, has fallen apart. And so really, even if that was not the case, just based on damage and its own domestic concerns, the Islamic Republic should be working on rebuilding itself, and also focus not just on itself, and taking care of its population, but it also needs to not be arresting, torturing them, but instead putting bread on their tables, security over their heads, and peace of mind. So I think in this way, by all means, the conversation with Saudi Arabia should continue. The Saudis were pleased with the destruction, obviously, of those proxies and the forward defense strategy prior to June. There was already a recalibration in the region, and as the Saudis were kind of pretty clear about that, and sort of marked the Israelis as the unstable actor in the Middle East. So even if Tehran sees its neighbors suspiciously, or that they might be pleased with what's happened, it needs to just focus inward and actually do the right thing as a government. And maybe then it will get tangible support from formal rivals and neighbors like the Saudis. And that might help them more with, not to sort of give advice on how to sustain that government, but that's what it should do.
So from that perspective, last follow on this one, do you see there being perhaps a possibility, a higher possibility now that the negotiations with the United States will move forward because the regime needs that space and needs some level of sanctions relief to do the domestic development and, invest in its own people and economy?
I mean, so one of the other takeaways is not to trust Trump, right? So, he gave a 60-day time limit. So, and day 61, there were bombings. He gave 2-week window for him to consider the US getting involved, and it happened on day 2. So this just compounds and exacerbates the existing mistrust from him walking away with the JCPOA. Do I think that there's room? Yeah, I think there's a small room because Trump wants a deal, but the question becomes, what are they, is there actually going to be sanctions relief? And will Trump, one of the things that came with JCPOA, the Islamic Republic wanted to silo some of the sanctions and didn't want to talk about all the things that were on the table. And so as a result of that, they were very surprised when the JCPOA and the nuclear deal get done and there are still sanctions on them. So they have learned as part of this. And I think what becomes a question is Trump himself actually willing to do a deal? And what kind of sanctions are going to be part of that deal? And is he going to expend political capital? Because Obama was not willing to go further. Biden did nothing. But would Trump be willing to expend the political capital to get Congress in line and or just issue executive orders? And so it begs the question, after the bombings, what do the Iranians have that they can persuade Trump to do those things?
Nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize, I guess.
So I'm going to pose that question to you. What does the Islamic Republic have aside from, that Trump wants to say he got the deal? I mean, so we have to look at those realities. Is Trump actually willing to do a deal? And how much do the Iranians have to offer? I think, the fact that, so we'll just leave it there.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be interesting. And I think that's where the dynamics of the Republican Party coalition itself, as they've played out over the last few weeks, will continue to play out because that infighting, particularly in Congress, is going to be quite nasty if it comes to that, if he tries to get Congress in line. So we'll see. As always, before I let my guests go, what are 2 or 3 books you would recommend to the audience?
So I have a new and old and a sports one. So for new is Andrew Preston's Total Defense. Seems apropos, the origins of national security. So it's a historical perspective. In terms of something old, Joseph Kiernan's Opera is Drama. So we'll go a little bit different. And then because I love sports and basketball is one of my favorites, Sam Anderson has a book called Boomtown, the Fantastical Saga of Oklahoma City. And that's apropos since they just won the basketball championships in the US.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not a huge basketball fan, but the Oklahoma City story was quite fantastic to follow.
There you go. So there's a book, and and you've got to love that, the Fantastical Saga of Oklahoma City. There's more to that title, but it's too long.
I'll check out that. I love sports books, so I'll definitely check that one out. But as always, pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for your time. And look forward to having you again on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Uzair.